Here's Dustin.
Nice. Great. Well, thanks for inviting me, and thanks for putting your group together. I think after I was here before, I think people seemed really interested in the ideas. And I've done other talks at other places where people were interested in the ideas, and then they just went off, right? And with our jobs, that's easy to do, right? We have a few other things to do. It's hard to sort of commit the time and energy to do this. What I hope I can do today is give you a framework for how to do this. So when I talked before, I presented several ideas about these are the kinds of activities that can promote inclusiveness in STEM classrooms. And those sound very different from the kinds of inclusive strategies you hear for English classrooms, right? Because of how we do what we do is very different. So I presented a few ideas. For those who weren't able to say that before, I'm happy to share all those slides, and I think those will give you some ideas. Here today, I want to focus on the process of how you implement this, how you go about choosing it, and then how do you plan ahead of time? How do we measure the right stuff? Okay. The next meeting is all about your individual ideas, right? What makes sense for your contexts. Okay. A lot of what I'm going to be doing today is going through tools to help you and sort of ideas for how to structure and scaffold your approach over the next few weeks. I'll give you a logic model example that is sort of tailored for this kind of research. And I'll give you an example from my own research. Right, so here's how I think and plan about this. There will obviously be some differences between what I'm doing and what you're doing in your classes. But the goal of this is to give you an example so that you can get started on your own and bring this back next week. Initial ideas. Two principles I'm going to start out with that you'll hear me reiterate at the end is the idea of possibly useful, definitely incomplete. Whatever you do here is possibly useful, definitely incomplete. Ideas early on are always possibly useful, definitely incomplete. So the goal is not to come back with something perfect, right? That's not a reasonable expectation for a week. The second is to avoid solutionitis. Okay, we've all been in faculty meetings where there's a problem, and 28 solutions get put out there, or however many solutions there are for the number of people. What we're going to work through is how to avoid solutionitis by focusing on why we think the problem is happening. Not just any solution works. We want a solution that fits for what we think is happening in our classroom in the context we're studying. That means that we have to start with the focus on the individual, the student, or the problem that we're seeing. Right? So we're not just implementing stuff because it's fun or it's interesting or we want to change something up. We're doing things to solve a problem. And so we're going to start with that context and then work through a logic model of how do we get to what are we trying to change? How are we going to do it? And how do we measure whether that's working out? Okay. Next time, we'll hold what I'll call a design thinking workshop. This is small group brainstorming. What are the ideas? How are you thinking about translating what I'm talking about here today to your own contexts? How do we build principles for how you guys can work together throughout the semester? Right? What are the ways in which you can facilitate collaboration and building on each other's ideas? Identifying your internal resources and external resources. And I'll be focusing on sort of individual consultations. For anybody who says, I'm stuck, I don't get how to do this, we'll brainstorm together and individually. Okay. We'll have some sort of third follow-up where I can sort of keep providing individual consultations as needed. We'll figure that out later. Okay. So I'm going to give you a model that I've developed with colleagues at the Carnegie Foundation and at the University of Virginia. It comes out of work from both of those places. And the idea is, how do we start with the focus on the person? And how do we start with thinking about designing interventions and scaling them, right? So the idea is that if we want to start with a problem, we need to start with empathy, right? Whatever problem we're defining, if this is an achievement problem, if this is a I don't feel like I belong here problem, if this is a I'm confused about something sort of problem, we need to start with empathy about who's having this problem and what's going on. How are they making sense of the world? What are the right kinds of learning processes that are happening, right? As students come to our universities, they're learning the content of what we teach them. They're also learning all the invisible rules. This is why things are what they are. This is how this works. So how can we start from a point of empathy to understand what is the context that they're learning, right? What is this context that they're pulling information from? Of course, they're going to learn from it differently than we do here, right? We see this place very differently than they do. But how do we start with that point, right? And listening to stakeholders, this is sort of broader language, but typically means the students in our case. Okay. What the workshop is all about is synthesizing and planning. Right? Once you really understand the problem that you're wanting to solve in your classroom or in your department, how do we make plans about that? I'm then going to advocate for small-scale testing. Instead of saying, I think we have a solution, let's do this in all of my classes. Let's do this in every class in the department. Well, if we think about engineering, right, you would rarely say, here's how we think this will work. Let's do all the bridges in the state this way. Right? Well, no, you're going to do some small-scale tests. You're going to build prototypes. You're going to figure out what doesn't work. You're going to fail, and you're going to learn from failure. And that's an expected part of the process. Okay? But we're not just going to sort of implement stuff and see what happens. We're going to collect data and get feedback about it so that we can learn smartly from failures. We're going to expect failures, and we're going to look for data that help us learn from those. Okay? Throughout this iterative process, and this can be very quickly for some folks, it can be slower for others, it depends on the context. Once you feel like you've got good data and you've learned from it, then you can sort of finally adopt it. Okay. A lot of folks start with, let me plan an activity and let me scale it. But I think that these two steps are really hugely important and something that the processes that I've been working with seem to help a lot with. Okay. So the tool that we'll use and that I think will help us sort of design these for yourselves is going to be a logic model. And these are widely used, and there's lots of jargon around them. I'm going to try to strip down some of the jargon today, which I hope will be helpful. But there's 5 basic steps. The first is identifying what do you think is the problem. This turns out to be harder than you think it is. We all seem to think we know the problem, but how do you really define it? We were just joking. Someone said, oh, I'll be back in a moment. We said, how do you define a moment? How do you define what problem the students are having or what problem you're seeing is actually takes a lot of time and energy. Okay, so we'll start here. Then we're going to think about what mechanisms or what creates this problem. Okay, so instead of just figuring out what is it, we need to go to think about why. Okay, this might be an overdetermined issue. There might be multiple things that create some student struggles, but we need to at least think through why is this happening. We need to figure out what resources we have that we can put into solutions. Right, if I think students are struggling in my class because their high school math was bad, I don't have the resources to fix that. That's not something that I'm able to do. In theory, with $1 billion, maybe I could fix statewide math stuff, but I can't. So what resources do I have? And so how can I approach what's in front of me now? Okay, so this helps us sort of balance what's realistic and what we can and can't do. Okay, then we're going to plan activities. We're going to talk about planning activities that very specifically map onto these mechanisms. Okay, this is another sort of common misstep. People plan activities that they've heard about, but they don't necessarily fix what the problem is here. This might fix a problem I've heard about at a New York school, and maybe the reasons why the students are having troubles in that context is very different than what's happening on this campus. Okay, so at each step, we're going to really try to map on and sort of tightly connect our ideas and our principles at each step. And this is where Joe's really excited. We're going to specify our outcomes. Okay, there's not just one. If I change what I'm doing, what are the immediate effects on students? And then what happens over time? What kinds of things should we expect behaviorally, experientially? Right? How do we start to define these? And again, how do we map these on to these? Right? If I think my activity should change them for some specific way to solve this problem, how do I map on outcomes that are closely tied to the mechanisms? Okay. So I'm going to go through an example of all this. Okay, so that you can see how thinking from a project that I'm actually still running connects all of these lines across them. Okay. Oh, sorry, I have to identify measures for everyone. Okay. The logic model is not a static document. Okay, this is another thing that people sometimes get tripped on with logic models. Right, we really try to understand our students, and obviously you guys are already doing that or you wouldn't be here. These things are self-selected to some extent, right? You think a lot about your students and you care about them. Now that we're planning, we'll come up with something for this semester, but what we learn from all the prototyping, from any little stuff we do, means that we need to change the logic model. We might learn that we were wrong about some of the mechanisms. We might learn that we actually were wrong about something about the problem. Okay? Expect to change this as you go. Okay, this is a dynamic document that every time you learn something about the problem, about the students, about the activities you're running, this might change. And that's okay. Right? When you think about it as a process that's designed to be built on small-scale testing and quick learning, then we assume that this is going to change. Okay. All right. So the example I'll present today maps onto a couple of handouts. So I've got a blank handout and then one from mine. And if you can resist the urge to read what's immediately in front of you, which is really hard to do, by the way, it helps when you have food to distract you. Yep. So what I'll do is the coming slides map onto each of the steps. Right? The logic model you see is just a visual table of the steps in a logic model, and the slides I'll show map on almost exactly to this. Okay? But it helps put it in a more condensed form. Okay? All right. Part of what I'm going to say is that our processes are going to differ. Right? The kinds of studies and interventions you guys are going to plan are somewhat different from mine, in part because we're starting from a different position in the context. When I do studies in science classes, I'm not the teacher. It's not my class. I'm coming in from an outside perspective. You guys are all insiders in that sense. There are pros and cons to having both positions, right? And so it might be helpful to partner with someone who's an outsider at times. I need insider partners, okay? But when I talk about the planning and how this works, my positioning or where I'm starting is different. The context is quite different, so you'll hear me talk about things like one of our outcome measures is class attendance. At SDSU, about half our students come to class, most classes. If we're lucky, I think that's quite different than here. And so I think there are some really important context differences, and that's going to be highlighted on a lot of the slides, is no measure makes sense across every place. Right? The context is different, students are doing different things, and how you think about measuring things, why something is happening, is tied to place. It's not just, students aren't doing the same thing everywhere. Okay. There's also available resources. I had a research grant to do this, so it was a little bit different. But here's the problem we started out with. Okay. We started out knowing that students from underrepresented minority backgrounds tend to persist at lower rates than students from majority backgrounds. Even though they're often choosing STEM majors, in our case we're looking at biology and chemistry majors in this context, they're often choosing them at very similar rates. The dropout rates are much higher. Okay. The point of attrition was highest during the foundational classes. So this is not necessarily the general education biology on our campus, but we have a biology class for STEM majors. We have a chemistry class for STEM majors. And so we targeted those classes because we thought, based on the national data and data from our institution, we identified where dropout was happening at differential rates, right, at sort of disproportionate rates.
And are you including failure rate in that, or just withdrawal?
So the problem we tackled was really people not graduating. Oh, okay. And we thought that if we address this early, which could be failures, it could be withdrawals, it could be Cs, right? So if someone, the difference between a C and a B in your first biology class, if you think about a student sort of finishing, what does that mean about who I am, can make a big difference. So our goal was to try to help students get more motivated, more engaged, and raise their scores in these classes.
Do we try to, in this particular scenario, was there any try to separation on the types of minorities? Like, for example, I see a big difference between, say, Asian, Middle Eastern versus,
yes,
minority groups. And I don't see a huge dropout rate.
Yep.
With Asian minorities.
Absolutely. So some of the intricacies of this I wasn't going to go into because I just think it takes more time. This particular grant was written for the National Institutes of Health, and they define underrepresented minorities as Latino, African American, Native American, and Filipino. You can also sometimes include first-generation college students in that. So it sort of depends on which agency you're applying to work with, so it gets a little messy. Yes, you're right. And part of the data that we mapped onto when we looked next at the mechanisms was very specifically for these groups. And so you're right that it's different across the students. Okay. So the problem we identified was an achievement gap or a persistence gap. Okay? And we thought, how can we try to close this? This is a point where you've got to figure out what can we do at this institution and where can I put my time. In our example, the problem is defined as a gap. That means that one of the implications is we're going to design activities that we think are going to help some students and not necessarily others. Some people really have a pushback to this idea. Some people think that any activity should help all students. Depends on your context, depends on the administration around you. We all understand sort of politics of academics and how this works in personal beliefs. Okay? How you define your problem is going to change what mechanisms you are going to define to cause it and what activities you're going to plan. So I said that defining that problem sounds really easy, but it has implications for everything else. Right? We started with a gap kind of problem, and that means if you're raising everybody, the gap is still there. Okay, so we started out with a different kind of problem. I've had on plenty of other projects where we're looking at sort of raising participation rates for everybody. Right? Different projects have different problem needs. But when we start with a problem-focused approach, that's got to be defined early on. Okay. So you've got to think through whether this is going to affect all students or only some students are thought to be beneficiaries. Okay. All right. So what are the mechanisms? Well, we thought that this is an overdetermined problem. I think most things in human behavior are. That means that there's more than one cause. Right? So why are students from certain groups persisting in STEM majors longer than other groups? There are many causes. Right? We went to the research literature pretty extensively. We've done lots of years of talking to students. And so one of the reasons that we focused on is that, or one of the things we focused on is what could we do that's very proximal to the classroom, that's connected to the pedagogy. Right? There's things we can't do around financial aid, for example. There's things we can't do around high schools that all contribute to this. What can we do that's very proximal to the classroom? What we came up with, and again, this is sort of based on lots of research literature and talking with students, is that a lot of students kind of miss the relevance of those early foundational classes. If you look at a lot of science education literature, science is really fun in elementary school. You're doing fun things all the time. In middle school, it's still pretty fun. High school, a little bit. At the end of college, it's also fun. You're doing lots of cool projects. You're learning lots of sort of applicable things. But the first biology and the first chemistry class are often really, really dry. In our context, there are 500-seat lecture halls. Our chemistry class is actually 850. So what are you doing? You're memorizing and regurgitating. Right? That's what's possible in that kind of context. Okay? What students often fail to see, and the next slide will sort of present a little bit of evidence for this, is they don't see how it's relevant. Right? I'm 18, 19 years old. I'm excited about college. I'm excited about life, choosing a career. I want something I'm passionate about. But I don't see how this connects to what's really personally meaningful for me. And this seems to be even more applicable for students from underrepresented minority backgrounds. Okay? And so we looked across lots of literature, sort of suggesting that this is part of the culture of science, the discipline of textbooks, what kinds of information tends to be conveyed in lectures. It's not the science itself, it's the connections that seem to just be missing from these kinds of classes. Okay. So again, when we're looking at our mechanisms, we're thinking hard about our students. We're also looking to see what else should we know about the mechanisms that's out there. Okay. And hopefully the talk that I gave last time, and I'll again be happy to share the slides for those who missed it, will give you some ideas of mechanisms and some more ideas around activities. Okay.
Can you back up just?
Of course I can.
That's that middle resource.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just tell me what that means a little bit?
So you mean this one or this one?
That one, successful assimilation.
Yep. So Carlone has done a lot of interview work with students who are progressing through science education. And what she finds is that in other disciplines, they encourage you to sort of think about how you're doing what you're doing in broader ways. What students experience in science is that they learn, I have to fit these methods, and I have to do things in this narrow, disciplinary-based way. That rather than sort of pushing me to think creatively and flexibly, my mind is sort of narrowed.
And so that excludes people reject science because they don't feel like they can do that, or that's just not intriguing to them?
Yeah, so I think for two reasons. Is they experience it as less sort of identity supportive. If I think that there are other ways to do this, that's being discouraged. Or I can never find ways to do this if I look forward in the future.
So they just
Again, I don't think this is what science is. I think that students in these courses, this is how they see it, right? So it's at a point in time when they're learning. And I mean, when I talk to scientists, like no one thinks this, right? It's all about creativity and collaborative work. But you ask most students and they don't think there's any collaboration in science. They think you're alone by yourself in a lab and that you're very focused in some narrow way that you can't be creative.
So this really stems from their history in science education in their formative years in middle school and high school, and like epistemology, like the way that they see science, the way they believe science to be,
Right.
and how you think in a science class.
Right.
And so, yeah, so I can see how automatically if they see, well, this is how science is, and I don't think that way, well, then clearly it's not for me.
Right. There's no other option for me to change anything, or for me to have a different route, or for me to sort of, integrate a science project that's integrated in with the community.
Right.
That those options just aren't there.
Because you're just in a lab and you're just following steps in a sequence, and that's it.
Yeah, and of course they are there. These students often just don't know that. Yes.
But so I'm just curious because these though are students who chose to study science.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where so at some point they didn't believe this in their formative years. So even though they got this in the because I kind of feel like if in those years they saw this, if it was, they wouldn't be made. So where, so that's just, so there's obviously been a shift.
Yep. So two things are happening. It's interesting. Yep. So developmentally, as students, as people hit late adolescence, we're going through this sort of identity questioning phase, right? Who am I? What am I going to do? So some of the students sort of picked this because they're good at it. They encouraged it. They had a fun high school teacher, but they're just sort of hitting the developmental period where they're thinking about this. Like, what does this mean for who I'm going to be going forward? So the developmental timing of this for early undergraduates matters. The other piece is that I think there's a lot more variability in terms of how science is taught in high schools. Some teachers can have these sort of broader views or sort of frame it, and then they get to these classes that are, again, 850-seat lecture halls in our context, and they're just memorizing facts. And they're going, I don't see this as a good life. Yeah, and so we assume we can't make all of our sections 15 people. Right? That would be fantastic. At SDSU, that's not realistic. We're working with several other universities, so I won't say where, but my colleague is in a chemistry class that's 2,200 people. Makes our 850 seem small. Yeah, right. It's all relative. So if we can't change 2,100. So if we can't change those contexts, is there something we can do in the classroom to help students' beliefs about this stuff change? Right, so that's our goal. It is.
So the 2,200 guy is in this study?
So I'm actually not even going to present data today. I'm going to talk about sort of how we did this. I mean, I've got the data. I can show you the data, but the 2,200 is ongoing right now.
We're going to be thinking about 2,200 for a long time.
Yeah, that's a big number. So can we create an activity, right? If we think about our mechanisms for how we can create change, can we change students' beliefs? Right? Can we get them to be more motivated by seeing the material they're learning as more relevant? We assume that how we learn these things is mostly through what they read and what they're asked to do. Okay, so in classrooms, they're asked to read a lot, they're asked to do quizzes, they're asked to do assignments. So we're thinking about how can we approach either the content that they take in or an activity. We did not have the ability to change the content, right? We could not change the textbook or that sort of stuff or the lectures. Again, I'm an outsider perspective in this. You guys can actually change your lectures. You can change content. That wasn't an option for us. So as we're working through our ideas about these are the kind of mechanisms, this wasn't an option for us, but this one was. Okay? Could we create an activity that helps them link connections between what matters to them and what they're learning? And is that going to get them more engaged in the material, more engaged in the class, and actually perform better? Was sort of our underlying theory. Okay. The next step in the logic model is your resources. Again, for us, we had partners, right? Biology and chemistry instructors who were willing to let us do something in their class. What they were willing to do had barriers to that, of course, but we had partners. We also were able to identify students for whom we could use or sort of ask of their time and energy to test the iterative design steps, right? The small scale testing. How do we design good activities? We don't want to give our first draft of that activity to 2,200 students at once. We want to do a lot of small scale learning to make sure this thing is good before we roll out in real classes. right? Sometimes this stuff can backfire. What if our activity made people less interested in science? Right? Like, that's my nightmare stuff, right? For somebody who works in interventions research, what if we make these gaps bigger?
Made the decision a lot easier.
This is a real possibility. And so we want to know, what are these activities doing? How can we do small scale testing to figure out, does this change the target mechanisms that we want it? Does this help them make these connections? And does making these connections increase interest for what they're doing? Okay. We had a lot of support for our time and effort, and we'll come back to thinking about resources later when we come to measures. Okay? Because what you can measure depends on your resources. Okay. All right. So we're going to have two kinds of activities. All right, we're going to have our planning activity, so the intervention activity idea, and we're going to have a lot of prototyping and designing tests that we went through for this project. Okay. The first is that I actually worked with the folks sort of named here. We took versions of previous activities where they integrate essay assignments into science classes. Okay. So students are going to write 3 essays per semester about how their personal values, what they're learning right now can be related to their personal values. Okay. Some versions of these assignments had been used before. We didn't come up with these from scratch, but we adapted them to our context in helpful ways. Again, going back to that empathize and learn. We thought about, what are the students at San Diego State learning? How do we change these assignments to fit what they're learning, what their values are, and give them space to do this? I'll tell you that I'm also doing these in community colleges right now. The idea of writing level matters a lot when it's an essay assignment.
Yeah.
So the expectations you have for your students depend on your context. Okay. For some of our prototyping and designing steps, first we sort of created our prompt for what this assignment was going to look like. We did lots of small scale testing of the essays. We had lots of students who weren't in our real classes on the side read the prompt. We would give them like a few pages of material and say, okay, now that you've read these 3 pages about biology, can you write this kind of essay? And then we had them do a lot of evaluating. What was the assignment like, and how do you feel about this material now?
And
Okay.
are these all minority students that are your prototypes?
We did both, so we did everybody. And during the prototyping phase, we looked for differences. Right? Is the activity more effective for everyone? Part of what we learned from our early pilot data is that the essay got everyone to make the connections. But the kinds of connections that people make matter differently for different students. And so if you think about how these mechanisms lay out, the activity makes connections. The connections matter more for some people than others.
Or the types of connections.
The types of connections, yes, thank you. And so there are a couple of steps in the process. But again, we wouldn't have known to measure this stuff if we didn't start with a clear definition of the problem and a clear ideas about what are the mechanisms that are going to explain why this works. Okay. And that's really the tedious part of this stuff, is really sifting through what creates the problem. And then you're almost working sequentially to figure out, okay, how do we change that problem? How do we measure that mechanism? How do we keep moving forward? Okay. So we got them to we asked a lot of questions about, were the prompts clear? Were they difficult? Right? We realized that if these were too difficult, it would backfire. Boy, now I really don't see connections. I'm asked to, and I can't find them. That happened to us in a study. So we were in a study where we worked with research labs, and we had them writing about how is what you're doing in the lab related to some important value. Turned out a lot of our first semester lab students were cleaning dishes, and they said, I don't know. And we're like, oh great, now we convinced them science is really irrelevant. But that happened with a small group of like 5 or 6 students. Right? So we didn't roll this out at any big scale. The unexpected will happen here. And this is why, how do you give your assignment, your activity to a few students, a handful of them, and test out their reactions? Okay? We have a lot of designing and changing that came out of that. But you can see that the kinds of mechanisms we focused on, right, is this going to get them more engaged or interested in the material itself? Right? Is this going to change what they think about science? These are some of the stuff we measured, some of the questions we asked them during the small scale testing. We had versions that weren't so good. We figured out how to optimize the versions. Once we got to a version that worked better, we worked very closely with the instructors to make sure that it fit the content. Right? Remember, these happened 3 times throughout the semester, so we had to make sure that it was going to be relevant with the content that they were doing. Okay. Again, for you guys, because you are the instructors, you're going to have a different set of issues. Okay. Once we implemented this, we actually had real assignments in classes, 3 essays throughout the semester. Had to be graded, right, because these are real class assignments. We reasoned that if we're looking to get students engaged, an extra credit assignment, at least at the schools we were at, were going to be unlikely to be completed. And we wanted them to be paced out throughout the semester. Okay? So as we go through our options for how can we implement this, we decided on graded assignments. Most of the grading is about the science content. So these essays, I don't have that detail up there. These essays are 500 to 600 words. Most of the writing is about the science content they're learning. They're having to write about a question and then sort of write about how it connects to the material. And then toward the end, they write about how that connects to their values. So the vast majority of the graded portion is the science content. And then it's what we call following instructions, right? Are they writing about the values? But you're not grading which values they write, right? That seems mean. Okay. In terms of how we assessed is this working, okay, we included pre-post surveys in the semester, and we tracked a lot of behavioral stuff, okay? Things that were already actually happening in the course.
Pre-post survey of what? Their values?
So the mechanism, so I'll go into it in just a second, but the mechanisms that we thought we wanted to move. Okay. So how interested were they in the topics, the values that they thought science could support, and their interest in science. To the course, in this case, yes. Pre-post surveys are not always the best assessment activities. In this project, it made sense. There were some mechanisms that we could get at pretty well by tracking some of their patterns, some things that we couldn't, right? And so as you're brainstorming, right, you're starting with your list of mechanisms. And if you guys now want to feel like you have permission to look at the handouts that I gave you, you'll see the mechanisms kind of listed toward the middle. And the idea is that anytime we list out a mechanism, the reason why our activity should be working, we've got to measure it, right? In the optimal cases, the mechanisms can get at by some type of performance or behavioral measure that you think makes sense. Other times you just can't. And again, it really depends on your context and what your mechanism is. If your mechanism, for example, is do I feel like I belong, or do I feel like I'm part of the community here? I'm not sure what behavior gets at that. Right? But that is something students can report, honestly. Okay, so it depends on what your mechanisms are. In our activity, we used a randomized control trial design. Students were completely randomized to get a control version of the assignment in which they only summarized the material and did not write about values, or they got our experimental activities where they wrote about values. This is not possible in most small-scale classroom studies. Okay? It's something we did because this is a big study. Okay? Obviously, if we're using sort of scientific approaches, then randomized controlled trial gives you the best data. How do you know that something worked? Randomization. Right? We do this in biology. We do this in physics. Right? We know this matters. When we can't do this, how do we get as close as we can? Right? Pre-post tests help, but if everyone's getting the same thing, it could be that everyone changed regardless of your intervention. Right? Time was the causal factor here. Okay, so we've got to think hard about what design features can I do given my resources and my context, and what's going to give me the best data that I can.
So,
okay.
Sorry, the
yes.
control was they would get the assignment but without the value question.
That's right. It just asked them to summarize the material and provide references. So they got the same 500 to 600 word essay, but it was only summary. So, and one of the things we've, I don't know if it's criticism, but one of the things people discuss is they'll say, well, isn't that actually pretty great in science classes? They never get to write about this stuff. It's a very active control. We don't have a do-nothing control condition. For us, that just didn't feel right. It also didn't make sense as to how we could implement that. Students within the classes would know that some of them don't get this assignment. That just didn't seem realistic. What we did say, though, is we told students that these are new assignments. We're evaluating them to figure out which ones work the best. Not everybody gets the exact same prompt. And over time, it's going to change a little bit. So we changed the formatting of them. And so we told students, you might get slightly different assignments over time, or you might get different assignments than your friends. This is normal at research universities. So we created a sort of a cover story to make sense of that, and we've worked on that over time.
Did you have to go through IRB?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, especially when you're randomizing. Yes.
Yeah. Did you ever find that the students would sometimes go, wait a minute, come on, I got a different assignment than?
Yes,
Okay.
we get that regularly.
Okay.
And we have essentially a canned response that says this is part of improving classes. So we say that at research universities, I think you could say this at any university, that how do we get better with our classes? Well, we need data, right? So we say part of improving education is we take an improvement science approach. Students have no idea what that means, but it sounds fancy. Right? We use an improvement science approach, which means we collect data on what's most effective for learning. The only way to collect good data is to get a variety of assignments. And students actually go, oh, okay. I mean, it depends. You couldn't do two assignments that are so different from each other, right? There are boundary conditions to this, of course. In this case, it worked.
So, another approach for smaller classes for education is if you have already control data that you've collected over the last several years, that you haven't added this particular assignment, and you can argue that they are similar, you have test data or whatever, then you can implement it, and then you can argue that it's comparable, and you're adding this additional thing, and now you can make that argument.
And the next semester.
That's right.
Right, exactly.
Yep, you're a few slides ahead of me. So we've got some other options. No, it's great, I love it. No, it means you're hanging right in there. So some of the options include if you have multiple sections, you can do slightly differently across sections. You can do something differently across semesters. I think there are plenty of options that help you get around this if giving different assignments won't work in your context. And there's lots of which one they probably won't. It doesn't make as much sense. Yeah. Okay. So our outcomes. Okay. First, for our short-term outcomes, we looked at the essay content. Right? With this activity that we did, we get data right away. Right? They wrote something, and we can look at the content of that writing. If one of our mechanisms is about making these connections, are they making the kinds of connections we want? Okay. We learned that sometimes, on a different study, I've learned that sometimes what you do in your small scale testing with a small group of students does not translate the same way to a big class. I rolled out one class where in our small scale pilot testing, the essay prompt that we used got them to write these really rich, fantastic connections. When we got to a classroom, it turned out it was very easy to mail in this assignment and still get the points. They could do very, very thin connections, but it was technically following the directions. And we realized, oh, everyone's doing that. Okay, so we didn't move the mechanism we were trying to move. Right? Something about shifting from people doing it in a small group and in a room to this big class and for this assignment that they already felt like there was too much happening in this course. They tried to get this assignment done as quickly as they could, and their connections were very thin. Okay, and so by looking at the essay content in that study, we realized we need to change the assignment. Right? This isn't doing what we want it to do. Okay, so the first outcome is the essay content. For the medium-term outcomes, and on the next slide, I'm going to define how we measured these things. Okay, so first we define our outcomes. What is it that we want to move? Then we figure out how do we measure each one. Okay. So we thought that this would increase motivation, engagement with the course, and engagement in the content. For our long-term outcomes, it was grades, and it was sort of career interests and their perceptions of fit or compatibility with STEM fields. Okay. Again, these are all the things I mentioned early on in the mechanisms. Right? All the things that we thought were creating this problem, we've now sort of defined as our outcomes. Okay, so how did we, yes?
Sorry, can I ask a question about what you mean by engagement? Do you mean engagement in the activities during the course itself? Like activities real time? Or, yeah, so I'm wondering what you mean by course engagement.
So at the theoretical level, it's sort of how invested am I in this course? Okay. Right? Sort of how into it am I? And that's a little bit different from engagement with course content. That might be how hard am I studying? How much time am I reading? How you operationalize or measure these depends on the context.
Right.
But these are the things that we set out with. These are the outcomes we want to move. And our challenge is, can we measure these things? Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. Right? In real context, you can't measure everything you want. We did not get eye trackers and figure out what were they reading. Right? They would not every day tell us how hard they were studying accurately. Right? So there were things we would love to get, but it's not feasible. Okay. So what did we get? Well, in the short term, we actually had graders for the content of the science. We then later had some research assistants score the kinds of values and the kinds of connections that they were doing. So we actually were able to quantify this and look to see differences both with respect to intervention conditions and control, as well as were students writing about different kinds of values. Okay. The medium-term ones, which I think you're most interested in, is as we start to talk with the instructors, we realize that they have these 20-item homework quizzes in this particular class. And you can do these as quizzes multiple times. What we learned as we talked to students about this class is that this is pretty much effort. If you work hard, you're going to get the full points or really close to it. If you're pretty lazy that week, you might get a 10 out of 20, but you could have done the assignment again, right? Either life happened or they didn't put a whole lot of motivation into it. So we thought that these 20-item homework quizzes reflected, at least in some portion, effort and motivation. They also had these in-class clicker quiz scores. As we talk to students, this is mostly about attendance. If you're there and not watching a movie on your laptop, you get most of these right. These aren't super hard questions, but they weren't designed to be from the instructors, right? Students who are getting the highest scores are in class and paying attention. Right? Remember when I said context matters? At SDSU, this is a big problem. This measure might not make any sense here because all the students are in class.
So you're just measuring whether they attended class or how many clicker questions they got right?
This turns out those are highly correlated. So we don't have, yeah, so.
That's how Gen Chem is here too, right? You're here, click.
Yeah. These are mostly about like fill in the blank on a slide. And these aren't, the instructor didn't design these to be super hard. It was really as a way to get students engaged and kind of quick feedback. And if you're there, they get most of these. Again, remember, so we're outsiders in this. We didn't have any control over these things. But as we learn more about the context, okay, this has a lot to do with effort, this has a lot to do with class attendance. And engagement with course content, we couldn't get any measures about studying, but we got their exam grades. So we know for each section of the course, how well are they performing? And can we tie that to the essays they wrote? Okay. So,
in some of my classes, I have electronic textbooks, and I can actually see how much time they spend on every page.
yeah.
It's really
That's right.
interesting, and sometimes students will come to me and say, I'm really struggling, and I'll look and see how much they read.
Mm-hmm.
That's awesome.
And
Yes.
talk to them about,
Yes.
I read really fast.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's super smart. So when you got to figure out what is your context and what do you have, right? What kind of metrics can you use? In this case, we had asked them about those kinds of things, but they linked out to a publisher's thing, and we couldn't get those data in the same way. And so it depends on the context, right? But you can think really hard about what kind of metrics do I have? What's already built in? For these kinds of assignments, the instructors had never thought about these as effort and attendance. But that's kind of how we see them after we really learned from students. Okay. For the long term, we got the grades from the instructors, and then we are able to long-term track students to see if they stay in the major. But that takes a long time. In the short term, we did end-of-semester surveys around how likely are they to stick with these majors, how likely are they to change majors, and to what extent do they see themselves as compatible with the STEM fields and
When you
careers.
say higher grades, you're comparing it to what?
To the control condition in our case, yes. So remember that our points of comparison, because we had a randomized control trial, we have those who are writing the summary essays and the value essays. We also have groups of students. So we.
The final exam scores, I thought that's what higher grades was.
This is the total score in this class. We work with another group who's in Baltimore, and they use a standardized score that happens across a lot of colleges, a standardized final exam. Our instructors didn't use that, but now they can much more easily compare across semesters because it's a very standardized exam. Our instructors didn't have that. So what these measures are, again, really depends on the context. And you've got to look thoughtfully about what your context is and what's available. Okay. All right. I think getting at the point that a lot of people were just asking about, anytime you list the outcomes that we think we're moving and how do we measure those, there's a gap. There's a set of assumptions you're making. Our assumptions that those quizzes are mostly about effort is probably partly right, but it's more than effort, right? It's not a perfect measure. And in the world of applied research, you don't always get perfect measures. Okay? And as we know, our exams are not perfect measures of learning, right? So we use imperfect measures all the time. But how do you work hard to get as close as you can and to make your assumptions reasonable? Well, that's part of what a learning community does, right? People will check you if you're making a pretty unreasonable assumption. And hopefully you'll help other people do that. right? Here's what I think it means in my class. Here's why. Here's what I can do. Here's what I can't do. Have you thought about this? This is what doing this in a learning community helps you with. Okay? But this is one of the biggest pitfalls to measurement, right? Are the assumptions. In some cases, you don't have to make big assumptions. I want to improve performance. I've got really good performance metrics. That's pretty easy. I want to move motivation. It's a little dicier. Right? I want to improve attendance. That one's easier. You can behaviorally track things more easily. What outcomes you want to measure are going to shape how big these gaps are and how comfortable you feel with these. But if we start with the idea of what are the mechanisms I'm trying to move, what does that look like in terms of outcomes, and then you work hard on how do I measure that, at least you're really closely grounded into what you're trying to change. Right? Some folks will just take the outcomes that they've got. Okay, I've got performance outcomes, so I need to do something that affects performance. They're working backward through the process. Okay, working forward by starting with the problem, thinking about the mechanisms. This stage is going to be hard, but it's going to create a much better activity that's going to solve the problem you want. Okay. Here's the slide I already said. To understand your data, you need comparison data. Right? If I say, oh, my students got an 85, well, is that good or bad? Depends. Right? Depends on, you could compare it to the semester before. You could compare it to some sort of control condition. You could compare groups of students. There may be pre-post that makes sense for what you're studying. Previous semesters, different sections of a class. Right? These are all kinds of options you can have. But you need to sort of specify some type of comparison. Okay? Some type of comparison that helps you make sense of the data. Okay. That was a lot of a logic model. You've got the identical thing in the handout. But remember, whatever we come up with, what I just showed you, is sort of a logic model at one point that's going to be iteratively changed. Okay. I showed you a logic model that came out of many years of research. Right? I've been studying this topic of value and connections and how students find this and how it relates to motivation for a long time. It didn't look like that the very first project. Right? The very first project was rough. Right? I learned a lot through small-scale testing. Right? Every time I go to a new school, every time I work in a new context, I learn a lot by understanding the problem. The same thing that shows up in the national data is not necessarily going to show up here. Right? We've got to start with empathizing and learning, and sort of changing our steps at each point along the way. Okay. So looking forward, we're about at the end of our hour. And the goal is for you all to start with the blank sheet you've got in front of you, and that I will also send you electronically because that just seems smart. What's the problem you want to tackle? Why do you think it's happening? Again, many problems are overdetermined. There's probably lots of reasons why. Just get them all out there. Start brainstorming with some of these. Okay, whatever you do is going to be possibly useful and definitely incomplete. Right, wherever you start, it's possibly useful, definitely incomplete. Okay. Rather than focusing on all the solutions, focus on the mechanisms. Why is this happening? What can I do to change those things? Okay. If I know why something happens and I can tackle it, I can also measure the process outcomes. Right. In the study I described before, one type of outcome is that we change motivation. So we show that the mechanisms move, but it doesn't affect the course grades. What does that mean? Well, it means we created an activity that improved motivation. Now, why doesn't motivation relate to grades? That's the question for the next study, okay, the next iteration of this design cycle. Right. If we never measured the motivation piece, we just say, oh, it didn't work. We didn't move grades. We throw it out. Right. But it turns out we actually were moving the mechanism. But for some reason, that didn't translate to grades in this course. Does it translate to grades in a different course? Or there's something about how they're measuring performance, or grades in this case, that really isn't about motivation. Right. That's part of why we really avoid focusing just on solutions and focus on the reasons why these problems are happening and how we can change those things. Okay. It gives you much better information for when we fail and how we learn from failures. Okay, 'cause that's going to happen. As you move through each cycle, keep thinking about the people that you're trying to help. Right? How are they learning what's in their environment, and how does this new change the way that they're learning? Okay, keep it user-centered and sort of problem or solution-focused. Okay. There's a lot of value in this small-scale testing. And knowing that some of the assignments you create are going to flop, learn that early with small groups of students. And know that each time something fails, you're going to figure out how to do it better. When folks are not used to this process, sometimes there's a worry, right? I mean, we've all had assignments flop in class. Or if you haven't, you're much better teachers than me. I've had lots of assignments flop in my own classes. And I really would have liked to see that with 5 people before my whole class. So I didn't always take my own advice when implementing stuff in my own class, and I wish I had. There's a lot of value to that. A lot of students who don't understand what this thing means. Okay, how can I make this clearer? How can I create some better structure for them? There's also going to be a big value of the network communities in all of this. If we know that we're all new at this, if we know that any of our ideas are possibly useful but definitely incomplete, sharing them across everybody is going to help. It might be brainstorming, why do we think this happens? Right? Ryan might have a very different idea than Heidi about why this problem is happening. Both can be right. There can be multiple causes to student behavior and student performance. That doesn't mean we can address every one of those in our project. We can potentially boost performance by moving one of them. Which one does it make sense to move in this engineering class? Okay. The brainstorming can really help around the measures. What are the right kinds of outcomes that map onto these mechanisms, and how can we possibly measure this stuff? Okay. It's also why you have an outside person here helping. Right? I've measured lots of educational stuff. Right? So don't feel like you have to do it all alone. Right? So I think I'm around, and I think there are lots of other resources too. Okay. So use the communities and use the brainstorming. And what we'll do next time is I'll ask you to send me your completed notes from your logic model 24 hours before our meeting. And I'll send you all an email to follow up with this too. So I'll send you the blank slate. I'll ask you to send me your completed logic model, or at least notes that get it started, 24 hours before our meeting. That'll give me a little time to think about it and see where everybody is. And then we'll work together to see what kind of progress we can make. See where are we struggling, where are we feeling really good, who's feeling stuff together, right? How can we help continue to build on this? Next week will be less structured, and it'll be focused on your ideas and building them.
But it's not next week.
Sorry, 2 weeks. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that.